The Mojave Desert, 11 a.m., 114 degrees. Marcus hadn't moved from that spot in 3 hours. His Belgian Malinois Kane was still digging, paws bleeding, breath ragged, refusing every command to stop. Marcus had tried everything. Kane wouldn't quit. Then the sand shifted, and Marcus saw what his dog had known all along, and dropped to his knees right there in the middle of that desert, unable to speak, unable to move, staring at something that had no business being buried in that place. My name is Marcus Webb. I spent 11 years as a combat engineer with the United States Army, 2 deployments to Iraq and 1 to Afghanistan, and I know what it means to work in conditions that want to kill you. The Mojave in July is not metaphorically hostile. It is literally, physically, biologically hostile. The ground temperature sits around 150 degrees on a clear day. The air temperature at 11 a.m. pushes past 114. Your body starts making decisions about what to keep running and what to shut down. Your brain gets slow. Your judgment softens at the edges. You make mistakes you wouldn't make in a climate-controlled room. I've worked in that desert for 6 years doing private security installation on remote properties. Ranches, investment parcels, off-grid compounds belonging to people who have money and privacy concerns and very little interest in explaining the combination. You learn not to ask questions in that business. You show up, you do the work, you leave. Kane came with me on every job from the day I got him, sitting in the passenger seat of my truck like a person, watching the road with those dark, focused eyes that Malinois have. The eyes that always look like they're running calculations on something you can't see. I got Kane from a veteran transition program in San Diego 3 years before the day I'm telling you about. He'd been through military working dog training, but had been separated from his handler after the handler was medically discharged. The program matched him with me based on a compatibility assessment that I thought was going to be bureaucratic nonsense, but turned out to be more accurate than most things the government has ever done on my behalf. Kane walked into the assessment room, looked at me for about 10 seconds, and sat down. The program coordinator told me that was the fastest he'd ever seen Kane make a decision about anything. He was 4 years old when I got him. 60 pounds, all of it functional. His coat was the standard Malinois tan and black, and his ears were enormous relative to his skull, which gave him a permanently alert expression that matched his actual personality exactly. He didn't play the way labs and retrievers play, with that full-body enthusiasm that spills into everything. Kane played the way he did everything else, with complete focus and clear intention. When he wanted to run, he ran like he was pursuing something. When he wanted to rest, he went completely still. There was no in-between with Kane, no idle mode. The job that changed everything came in on a Wednesday morning in July. Client name was listed in my system as Hargrove Properties LLC, which told me nothing useful, which was normal. The property was a 340-acre parcel about 60 miles northeast of Barstow, way out past where the highway becomes a suggestion and then stops being a road entirely. I'd done work in that general area before. There's a whole geography of forgotten land out there, parcels bought in the 80s and 90s by people who had plans that never materialized, sitting empty under the sun for decades, accumulating dust and legal complications. The brief said install perimeter cameras on a 6-point layout, GPS coordinates provided, no structures on site, access via fire road from mile marker 47 on Route 247. Standard setup, maybe 6 hours of work depending on the ground conditions. I loaded the truck the night before, Kane riding shotgun as always, and we left before dawn to get there before the worst of the heat. We reached the property around 8 a.m. The fire road was rough but passable, and the parcel itself was flat scrubland, broken up by dry washes and scattered Joshua trees and the occasional boulder field. I walked the perimeter first, Kane moving ahead and around me in his natural patrol pattern, checking the terrain the way he always did when we arrived somewhere new. He was thorough and methodical, and I'd long since stopped trying to rush that process because it was more useful than anything I would have done instead. By 9 a.m., I had the first 2 camera positions installed and was moving toward the third when Kane stopped. He'd been ranging about 30 meters ahead of me, moving parallel to a dry wash that cut diagonally across the northwest corner of the property. He stopped mid-stride, one paw still lifted, and turned his head toward the wash. I watched him. He stood there for about 15 seconds, completely still, processing something I couldn't detect. Then he moved toward the wash and started digging. My first thought was a ground squirrel burrow. The desert is full of them, and Kane occasionally got interested in the scent of small burrowing animals, though he'd never been particularly motivated to actually excavate one. I called him off, and he ignored me, which was unusual. I called him again with the command voice, the one that means this is not a request, and he turned and looked at me and then turned back and kept digging. I walked over to where he was working. The ground in the wash was sandy and loose, easier to dig than the hardpan surrounding it, and Kane was moving material fast, his front paws working in the focused, efficient way that Malinois dig when they mean it. I looked at the hole he'd started and saw nothing but sand. I told him to leave it using the full command sequence. He stopped briefly, looked at me again, with that expression that I'd learned over 3 years, meant I understand what you're saying and I'm telling you something more important, and went back to digging. I stood there in 109-degree heat and watched my dog defy every command I gave him for the next 40 minutes. By the time the hole was 18 inches deep, I'd stopped trying to call him off. Something in Kane's behavior had shifted past the threshold of what I recognized as a dog-chasing animal scent. The digging was too sustained, too specific, too directed at a single point rather than expanding the way you'd expect if he was following a tunnel. He was going straight down, and his breathing had changed, still working hard in the heat, but with an urgency underneath it that I hadn't heard before. I got water from the truck and poured some into my palm for Kane. He drank without stopping his work, lapping between digs, unwilling to step away from the hole for even 30 seconds. His paws were starting to show wear from the rocky sand. I could see the skin getting raw on his left front pad. I tried one more time to pull him back, got down on one knee and put both hands on him and said, "Kane, enough." He looked at me and I saw something in his face that made me let go of him and stand up and step back. I've spent years around working dogs. I know what focus looks like, and I know what distress looks like, and I know what it looks like when an animal is operating on something that goes beyond either of those things. What I saw in Kane's face in that moment was closer to obligation than anything else I have a word for. He was not excited. He was not playing. He was doing something he understood to be necessary in a way that overrode everything else, including my commands, including his own physical discomfort, including the 114-degree air that was making both of us slower and dimmer than we should have been. I let him dig. Another hour passed. The hole was nearly 3 feet deep and about 2 feet across. Kane had slowed because the sand was compacting at depth, requiring more force per stroke. His pads were bleeding lightly, small red marks in the sand around the hole. I kept giving him water, and he kept working. I'd set up a tarp from the truck as a sunbreak and positioned it to shade the hole as much as possible, but the relief was minimal. I was going through my own water faster than I'd planned and doing the math on how much I had left. Then the sand shifted. It was a subtle change. The material Kane was moving went from uniform fine sand to something with more texture, more resistance. Kane's digging changed rhythm immediately, becoming more careful, more deliberate, pawing at the material rather than throwing it. He pushed his nose into the hole and I heard the change in his breathing. A long, slow intake followed by stillness. I moved to the edge of the hole and looked down. The color was wrong. Sand is consistent in that desert. The same pale, tan gray for as far down as you'd ever need to go. What I was looking at in the bottom of Kane's hole was darker, grayish-brown, and the texture was wrong for the surrounding material, slightly fibrous with a regularity that didn't belong in natural sediment. I got down on my knees and reached into the hole. My fingers touched the material, and I felt what it was before I processed it consciously. Fabric. Dense, woven fabric, the kind used in heavy-duty tarps or military-grade wrapping. My hands went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. I looked at Kane. He was sitting back on his haunches watching me with those dark eyes, his sides heaving, his paws leaving small blood marks on the sand. He'd done what he came to do. I pulled my hands out of the hole and sat back in the sand and took a long breath. The desert was completely silent around us, except for the wind moving through the Joshua trees at the edge of the wash. No traffic sounds, no aircraft, nothing for miles in any direction except me and my dog and whatever was buried 3 feet down in a dry wash on a property belonging to Hargrove Properties LLC. I got my phone out. No signal, which I'd known since mile marker 31 on the drive-in. I had a satellite communicator in the truck for exactly this kind of situation, and I walked back to get it with Kane following close behind me, no longer ranging ahead, staying at my heel the way he did when he'd shifted into a different operational mode. I sat in the truck with the engine running and the air conditioning at maximum and composed a message to the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department on the satellite communicator. I gave the GPS coordinates, I described what Kane had located, and I said I had not disturbed the site beyond the excavation the dog had already made. I said I would wait on site. Then I sat there with Kane and we waited. The response came 40 minutes later, a confirmation that units were en route and an instruction not to leave the site or disturb anything further. I got Kane's first aid kit from the back of the truck and cleaned and wrapped his paws as well as I could manage. He sat completely still for the whole process, which was not like him during routine care. He was watching the approach road through the windshield. The first unit arrived 2 hours and 20 minutes after my message. 2 San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputies in a 404, followed 15 minutes later by a second vehicle that I recognized as unmarked law enforcement. The deputy who approached my truck first was a woman in her late 30s named Valdez. Efficient and professionally neutral in the way that good law enforcement is when they're assessing a situation they don't yet have complete information about. She took my statement, standing outside the truck in the heat, writing in a notepad, asking questions in a sequence that told me she was experienced and thorough. She asked how the dog had known where to dig. I told her I didn't know. She wrote that down without visible reaction. The second vehicle held 2 investigators from the sheriff's homicide unit. One of them, a tall, quiet man named Detective Reyes, spent 20 minutes at the excavation site before coming back to where I was standing and asking me to walk him through the morning in sequence. I did. He listened without interrupting, then asked one question. He asked whether Kane had shown any prior indication on the drive-in or during the initial perimeter walk of the location. I told him no, that Kane had given no indication until he stopped at that specific point in the wash. Reyes looked at Kane for a moment. Then he said he'd need the dog's training records and my documentation for the property assignment. I gave him everything I had. What they found in that hole I can give you, in the terms that eventually became part of a public court record. The fabric was military surplus tarp material wrapped around human remains. 2 individuals, adult male and adult female, based on the initial forensic assessment at the site. Personal effects were found with the remains, including identification documents that enabled the investigators to make a preliminary identification within 48 hours. The individuals were a couple from Victorville, California, reported missing 14 months earlier. Their disappearance had been investigated as a voluntary missing persons case and had gone cold after 6 weeks without leads. The property, Hargrove Properties LLC, turned out to be one of 7 parcels connected through a chain of shell companies to a man currently serving federal time in Arizona on unrelated charges. The investigation that followed took 11 months and resulted in 3 arrests and 2 convictions on charges I won't detail here because parts of the case are still working through appeals. Detective Reyes called me the day the first conviction came through. He's not a man who uses many words, and the call was short. He told me the case was closed. He told me the families had been notified. Then he asked me how Kane was doing. I told him Kane was fine, that his paws had healed completely and he was back to full duty. Reyes said good. He said that in 22 years of homicide work, he'd had 2 cases broken by dogs, and that both times the dog had known something that no investigator in the world would have found by conventional means. He said he didn't know what that ability was or where it came from. He said he'd stopped trying to explain it and started just being grateful for it. I've thought about that conversation a lot in the time since. I've thought about what Kane knew and how he knew it, and whether those are even the right questions. Working dogs are trained to find specific things: explosives, narcotics, human scent in wilderness search scenarios. Kane's training covered the last category, but training creates a framework, not a guarantee. The framework tells the dog what category of thing to pay attention to. What Kane did in that wash, the sustained focus, the defiance of commands, the 3 hours of work in conditions that should have stopped any animal long before they stopped him, that wasn't framework. That was something Kane decided on his own about what mattered. I've worked with him every day for 6 years now. He's 10, which is getting old for a Malinois doing the kind of work we do. His muzzle has gone grey, and he takes longer to get up in the mornings, and he doesn't eat as fast as he used to. I've started thinking about what his retirement looks like, what kind of life he deserves after everything he's given. And the thought sits heavy, because there's no version of that transition that doesn't feel like a loss. On the drives out to the desert now, Kane still rides shotgun, still watches the road with those eyes that are always running calculations. We go out past Barstow sometimes, past mile marker 47, past the fire road that leads to that parcel of scrubland where everything changed. Kane doesn't react when we pass that way. Whatever he carried into that wash, he left there when the work was done. That's what I've learned from 11 years with the army and 6 years with Kane. The work is the point. You find the thing that needs finding. You stay on it past the point where staying on it makes sense by any external measure. You don't stop because it's 114 degrees and your paws are bleeding and the person standing above you keeps telling you to quit. You don't stop because the math says you should have stopped an hour ago. You stop when it's done, not before. If you've worked alongside a dog that knew something it had no business knowing, leave it in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, share it. Kane dug for 3 hours in 114-degree heat for 2 people who needed to be found. The least we can do is make sure someone hears about it.